Man, I'm glad when everything works. So there's a few more supposed to be here, but they'll just have to get here late. A couple of things. I guess I've had a lot of questions this week wondering about what we're going to do with revival and all that. So I decided today we're just going to do what we plan to do. I ain't worried about COVID or what the government has to say about COVID. And I don't think our governor's going to do anything drastic like shut anything down. And I'm not going to make everybody wear a mask until somebody tells me I got to make somebody, but I don't think that's going to happen. So I've got a internal medicine doctor in Washington, D.C. that I helped raise, and two other doctors that I've known for 40 years. And they all three say, yeah, wearing the mask is a good idea, but you don't know who's able to spread this thing now. It's all messed up. But they said the mortality rate is so low that it's not going to be like it was the first time where there's just people falling out dead and filling up the hospitals and all that. So I feel better about it.
Don't they have an alpha variant now? They have the Delta and then have alpha.
I don't know.
Yeah, they'll go through the alphabet, I'm sure.
I want the Spanky and the alfalfa and I want the He-Man Woman's Haiti Club. I want to go back to those days. So anyway, so we are going to be again in 1 Kings. So got your Bible, you can turn to 1 Kings. We left off last time, I think, didn't we leave off with the prophet from Judah?
Yeah.
That was eaten by the lion, or attacked and killed by the lion, but not eaten by the lion.
No, we didn't do that.
First Kings,
Right. 1 Kings, we're going to start with verse 33 in chapter 13, so we can get some perspective. And then we are going to go over to 2 Chronicles when we get to a particular spot, simply because well, let's talk about that for a little while. Why is it that so much of what is written in 2 Chronicles seems to be, and there's more detail now. It was before that the King's account had more detail about David and Solomon, but now we're getting out of that dynasty and we're into the divided kingdom and all the various kings that we'll go through. And the chronicler, he is providing much more detail than Kings. And the reason why that probably is the way it is because the Chronicle accounts was written during and after the exile. Okay, so what's happening is people are coming out of a bad experience. They were disobedient to God, and the result of that was being uprooted from their homeland and being sent into exile. And so what the writer is doing is placing them square in the middle of their own history so that they can begin to understand that, yeah, this is what got us there, but then there's also embedded in the writing, this is the way out of here. Okay? And that comes through the faithfulness of God. So the Chronicles, they're quick to point out that God is still in control of this, and there's ways in which people can come to Him that will correct the mistakes of the past, which should be pretty comforting for us today. You know that there's a way back out of the mess that we create, and we are able to correct some of the mistakes of our past. But, well, we don't correct them. God corrects them. All we do is turn our heart to Him, and that becomes a major theme in what we'll look at tonight. So, we'll be bouncing around a little bit, but I'll take it slow. All right? You won't have to worry about me being manic, because sometimes I know I get manic in some of this stuff. Okay, so at the end of 1 Kings chapter 13, beginning with verse 33. So it says, after this happened, meaning that the prophet that had come from Judah, he pronounces the fate that God has for the altar that Jeroboam had built, that had offered all the sacrifices to the two calves, that were made. Anybody that wanted to be a priest, he would let be priest. Okay, so he came and pronounced a curse on that altar, but then he turns around and he does the same thing the prophet does that Jeroboam had done. He'd received a clear message from God as to what to do, but then he ignored doing it, and it wound up costing him his life. Okay, and so it's a microcosm of what Jeroboam's doing on this large national scale, where he got a clear word from God that he had been chosen to be the one that God would hand the Davidic dynasty to, but he can't remain worthy. And why? Because he turns to these other gods. And the reason why is what? The temple's still in the south. And so he knows as well as anybody that that's where God's name dwells. That's where God has chosen to have his name. That's his city. And so he had to come up with some competition, so to speak, for God, is what he was doing. So that the people could make that first in their life, rather than God first in their life. And so from a spiritual standpoint, we see this happening all the time in people's lives. Their priorities get messed up and they put the wrong thing in place of God, and life just doesn't work out the way it's supposed to work out. So that's going on here, and that's the overarching lesson for us that we'll see unfold and be retold over and over again with other details that are valuable to us, discovering what our identity with God is. That was the whole struggle when they get to this place where the kingdom is divided. Okay, the identity was clearly with David because God had chosen David, and it was well known as to why God had chose David. He was a man after his own heart. And then that's broken apart, and everybody's searching for their identity now with God. Jeroboam fails, Solomon's son Rehoboam fails, and then we get this king after king from the north and the south. Some do good. They start out good. They wind up failing and being evil. Some are just evil the whole time. Some are good the whole time. It's just a big hodgepodge mess. And so from now on till we get to the end of this study, we'll do a lot of study about individual kings and what their life was about and how their identity with God shaped their life and ultimately the life of the nation because they're the king. So verse 33 says, after this happened, after the whole thing with the prophet that's eaten or that's killed by the lion, Jeroboam still did not change his evil ways. Every time I read that, I think of Santana. You got to change your evil ways. Y'all don't know who that is? Oh, wow. I'll have to bring it some night and play it. Anyway, it's a line in the song. You got to change your evil ways. But he would not change his evil ways. He continued to appoint common people, meaning people that were not from the tribe of Levi, as priests at the high places. And the two high places were actually where these idols, these golden calves, were sitting. Anyone who wanted the job, he consecrated as a priest. So I guess you just go up to Jeroboam and say, hey, I want to be a priest. You're in, you're a priest. So the whole thing was a mockery to everything that God had set forth. And the reason why God had been very meticulous about the way he wanted things done was to portray the unique nature that he was giving to these people. That you do this in a particular way to approach me. You can't just approach me any way you want to approach me. I'm the God of the universe. And I've set out a way where this will have meaning for you. And because of that, I will have meaning to you. but he's just made a mockery of it. So the sin caused Jeroboam's dynasty to come to an end and to be destroyed from the face of the earth. So that's a summary statement. These 33 and 34 will between here and Second Chronicles will examine a lot of different things that brought that about. Okay, so here is a narrative that goes all the way through verse 18, and it's a thing that's precipitated around Jeroboam's son who gets sick, and of course Jeroboam's been told by this prophet that things are coming to an end. All right, but he doesn't change his ways. So now his son is sick, and he's trying to find out, what does this mean in relation to God? Okay, so he still has in his mind the notion that God is still in control, and I haven't been giving him his due. So he's a little fearful of what's happening here, okay? At that time, Jeroboam's son, Abijah, became sick. Jeroboam told his wife, "Disguise yourself so that people cannot recognize you as Jeroboam's wife. Then go to Shiloh. Ahijah the prophet, who told me I would rule over this nation, lives there. Take 10 loaves of bread, some small cakes, and a container of honey, and visit him. He will tell you what will happen to the boy." So it was not uncommon when you went to visit a priest or a prophet, you took a gift, because that's pretty much how they lived. They didn't farm, they didn't do any of that. They were prophets, and so they depended on the care of the people when they would come to consult them. So kind of like paying the attorney with a chicken, you know, kind of that deal. You're going to him, and that's how that happened. Now, at the time that this is occurring, Shiloh is pretty much in ruins. The Philistines had destroyed it, and it was. It never had really been built back. In fact, there's no evidence of Shiloh really recovering to be a real city until the 4th century BC, and this is like 700 and something BC. So there was a long period of time there where Shiloh laid in ruins, and the only people that did live there were holy men. And so you'll recall during Samuel's day, during Samuel's day, he operated out of Shiloh, but Saul, David, Solomon went there in some effort to gain his kingship. It's been an important place, but it's not a pretty place. It's just a desolate place. But it is where God's man lives there. So you would think that would be in Jerusalem, because that's where God's temple is. Okay? But very quickly we see we're dealing with the northern kingdom now, but when we get to the story of Rehoboam, and that's kind of expanded here down in verse 21, we see that they're making the same mistakes that they're making in the north. So the religious practices of both nations is in ruins, and the only people to speak for God with any credibility is this small band of prophets that are hanging out in the desolate, ruined Shiloh. So you can't always look to the pretty places, to find out where God's word's going to come from. Sometimes you have to look in the places you would normally expect, or to the men that you would normally expect, and discover what God's up to. So, verse 4, Jeroboam's wife did as he was told. She went to Shiloh and visited Ahijah. Ahijah could not see. He'd gone blind. He'd lost his eyesight because of his old age. But the Lord said to Ahijah, "Look, Jeroboam's wife has come in to find out from you what will happen to her son, for he is sick. Tell her such and such." Okay, this is Hebrew shorthand. You recall in several places when God would speak, it would be repeated 4 or 5 times, so that you really were unable to forget what God had said. Okay, and this, we hear it really just once. Okay, so it's kind of like God has lost his patience. One time's enough. You don't need to hear this thing over and over again to get the point. So look, it says, so verse 6, when Ahijah heard the sound of her footsteps, she came through the door. He said, come on in, wife of Jeroboam. Why are you pretending to be someone else? Meaning, this attempt to hide from God is not going to work. I have been commissioned to give you bad news. I like that. He didn't even ask if you want the good news or the bad news, because there's no good news. It's all bad news. Go tell Jeroboam, this is what the Lord God of Israel has said. I raised you up from among the people and made you ruler over my people Israel. I tore the kingdom away from the Davidic dynasty and I gave it to you. But you are not like my servant David. This becomes a theme. Who kept my commandments and followed me wholeheartedly by doing what I approve. You have sinned more than all who came before you. And that's a statement that goes all the way back to coming out of Egypt and into the wilderness. The all is all inclusive of those people. You went and angered me by making other gods formed out of metal. You have completely disregarded me. So what we're discovering here very quickly in this is that all of this falls on the shoulders of Jeroboam and nobody else. He is responsible in total for everything that God is going to do. And why? Because you have completely disregarded me. Now that's a tough thing to hear out of the mouth of God, I would think. So I am ready to bring disaster on the dynasty of Jeroboam. I will cut off every last male belonging to Jeroboam in Israel, including even the weak and the incapacitated. A hint as to what's about to happen to his son. I will burn up the dynasty of Jeroboam just as one burns manure until it is completely consumed. Dogs will eat the members of your family who die in the city, and birds of the sky will eat the ones who die in the country. Man. Indeed, the Lord has announced it, he says. He says, as for you, get up and go home. When you set foot in the city, the boy will die. All Israel will mourn him and bury him. He is the only one in Jeroboam's family who will receive a decent burial, for he is the only one in whom the Lord God of Israel found anything good. So all of Jeroboam's family, the only one that he's found any good in is really this innocent boy. And the word is not baby boy. This is a boy that would be approaching 10 to 12 years old, approaching manhood. There's the baby child, there's the infant child, and then there's that in-between way you describe a child, and then the next thing is they're becoming a man at 12 years old. So this is that child that's in those later ages. The Lord will raise up a king over Israel who will cut off Jeroboam's dynasty. It is ready to happen, meaning that this is already laid out. God's put it in motion. Nothing's going to change it. The Lord will attack Israel, making it like a reed that sways in the water. He will remove Israel from this good land he gave to their ancestors and scatter them beyond the Euphrates River because they angered the Lord by making Asherah poles. This is almost exactly what Moses said to him when he was checking out and handing things over to Joshua. He says, he's going to bring you out of this wilderness and you're going to go into the land that he promised me. But let me tell you what's going to happen. You're going to turn your heart away from him, and he's going to become angry with you, and he's going to remove you from this land, and he's going to ship you off to a land where your enemies live. But he says, don't fear. After a period of, and he gives the time, after 75 years, he's going to bring you back to this land. So this is God not fulfilling, but he foretold through Moses exactly what these people were going to do. And now it's being told again through this prophet. So Jeroboam's wife got up and went back to Tirzah. As she crossed the threshold of the house, the boy died. All Israel buried him and mourned for him. in keeping with the Lord's message that he had spoken through his servant, the prophet Ahijah. So we're reminded again at the end of this. For a long period of time, it looked like God was not involved. We go 17 years not hearing from God at all during the time that Solomon is building his kingdom. Okay? Rehoboam seeks out God but never hears from him because Rehoboam's already messed up. He carried on the practices that brought damage to the kingdom that Solomon had begun, but he increased that instead of fixing it. So all of a sudden, they wake the growling lion, God. He says, I'm not having any of this. If you've had kids, you've done that, where they'll throw a temper tantrum or do something that they defiantly know they shouldn't do. And you reach the point where you say, I am not having any of this. And you do things you never dreamed you would do to your children. You know, that's what happens. And there's a reason why that happens. Because you expect the children to turn their heart to you, to do what you want them to do, to obey what you want, how you want them to obey, because you've lived this and you've seen life, and you know already you want them to avoid some of the trouble that's out there. God knew the trouble that was out there, and he was doing his best to save his people from it. Plus, they were his priest in the world. And if you've called out people to be a priest nation, which says that you are going to be the intercessory between me and the rest of the world, they're going to want a life with me because of the life they see that they have with me and you. So they're going to want that. Well, if the people aren't with God, then he can't complete the mission. He can't accomplish what he wants to accomplish. And it's his own wisdom that has decided that he decides to use man to do this. But it's not a stretch. In the garden, he gave humankind a job, right? You name the animals, you take care of the planet, you do all of these things. We're going to be in this creating thing together. You're going to be fruitful and multiply. And of course, all that just flew apart when they decided to do things their own way. There wasn't any partnership with God. So the next thing that God gets busy doing is redeeming. I got to redeem people. They're in sin, and if I don't redeem them, they're lost in sin. And this is my creation, and I don't want to lose any of my creation. And so his original plan's still good. Well, I'll use people to help me in this recreation of life, this redeeming of life, this redemption of life. Because in that's where we build a relationship. It's not just having some spiritual encounter where you go out in the desert and sit on a pole for 25 years and pray and chant. You know, that's not the way God does things. He wants an active, get your hands dirty type of relationship with people so that he can get some things done. He's a doer, creator. That's his nature. And he wants to include us in that. All right. So verse 19. The rest of the events of Jeroboam's reign, including the details of his battles and rule, are recorded in the scrolls called the Annals of the Kings of Israel. Jeroboam ruled for 22 years, then he passed away. His son Nadab replaced him as king. So that's what's going on in the southern kingdom. In the northern kingdom. Now, when we look over so when we look over at the Chronicles, it says very little about Jeroboam other than, I'm trying to see where it is now. In the middle part of chapter 10, it talks about Jeroboam's rebellion against Solomon, or King Rehoboam, Solomon's son. And we don't get a whole lot about Jeroboam at all. None of the details that we had in Kings. And so, let's see. So we go back to chapter 14 in 1 Kings, in verse 21. Now we're being introduced to a little bit more of Rehoboam's reign in the southern kingdom. So both books, not only are you dealing with two different works, they're both recording events happening in both kingdoms. So today, if everybody here except Jim is on, or Matt, I don't know if you're on my roll. Should be. Anyway,
Probably.
if you use the Church Center app, which I encourage everybody to download the Church Center app, when you do, and you're on my roll, then you go to groups at the bottom of it, and you'll find Mark's Wednesday group. And then at the top of that, you'll see a place that says resources. And in that resources, there are charts that are really fantastic, especially the first one that is a photograph. It's the best thing I ever found on this. But it gives you this chart, and it tells you who is king, who is prophet, the dates, if they were a good king, if they were a bad king. Then you can look across and you see who their contemporary is in the southern kingdom. And then when they're exiled, it shows who the prophets are at the time. Then there's another resource on there that gives who the foreign kings are at the time that they're ruling. So you have, because when we get into this later, there's a lot of names of foreign kings and rulers that are hard to keep up with because they're this one the second or this one the third, or sometimes they share a name and they don't designate that it's the first, second, or third. And so it's hard to keep up. So having that will help you keep up, or help us keep up. And so I wanted you to know that that was there. Should all got an email today or something. If you have the Church Center app, I strongly encourage you to use the Church Center app. It's chock full of good stuff. All right, Rehoboam's reign over Judah. Now Rehoboam, son of Solomon, ruled in Judah, southern kingdom. Judah consists of Judah, the tribe of Judah, and the land that was occupied by the tribe of Benjamin. Benjamin was Joseph's youngest brother, and so he had a full share. And so what winds up happening, Benjamin has more border region than Judah does, to where the kingdom's divided. So there's a lot of fighting over the land of Benjamin and the tribe of Benjamin. And that's what the majority of the skirmishes become about. So Rehoboam was 41 years old when he became king and ruled for 17 years in Jerusalem, the city the Lord chose from all the tribes of Israel to be his home. His mother was an Ammonite woman named Naamah. Now the Ammonites descended out of Lot, so distant cousins is what we got here. Judah did evil in the sight of the Lord. They made him more jealous by their sins than their ancestors had done. So we just heard that Jeroboam held that privilege, that he had done more than any of the ancestors. But now we're finding out that under Rehoboam, Judah, where Jerusalem is located, where the temple is located, they're doing worse. It says they made him more jealous by their sins than the ancestors had done. They even built for themselves high places. The thing that had been going on in the north now has migrated to the south. Sacred pillars and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every green tree. There were also male cultic prostitutes in the land. They committed the same horrible sins as the nations that the Lord had driven out from before the Israelites. So the picture here is this. Now they're no different than everybody else. There's nothing special about God's people, no matter where you look. They're all making these terrible mistakes. They've just turned their lives completely over to pagan worship. The reference to male cultic prostitutes, man, there's 6 pages in a commentary about this particular term. It probably was male and female prostitutes, and it wasn't located in one place like we think about it in Greek and Roman culture when we get into New Testament. So it was literally on every hill and at every Asherah pole. This was going on. So it was like having, in our culture, streetwalkers everywhere, and this was a part of some fertility thing. Asherah was one of the fertility goddesses that were worshipped by Ammonites, and others in the region. So you recall, Solomon had married all these wives, 700 of them, or plus, and a lot of them had come from these pagan areas, and they had all brought their different religious beliefs. And toward the end of Solomon's reign, he began to relax and let them practice their different religious beliefs. And under Rehoboam, it's just spreading like wildfire. Okay. The other thing that I want to remind us too is that one of the reasons why Jeroboam had built the 2 golden calves was because people were migrating to the south so that they could worship Yahweh in the temple. And if you recall, the priests, the Levites that had been left in the northern kingdom at the time that it divided, they all began to move to Jerusalem because they wanted to be where they could serve in the temple and worship God. And of course, none of that's made any difference. Because the priesthood, I mean, what authority does the priesthood have that's not given to them? It's given by God, but it is validated by the king, which we'll see as we move through. The priests that remain loyal to Yahweh become persecuted, and the prophets that stay loyal to Yahweh wind up imprisoned. And so having holy men on the ground wasn't making a big difference. We'll get into Chronicles. It's the way where is our heart? Where is the heart oriented? That's the only thing that matters to God. Doesn't matter who's there, doesn't matter what's going on. It's how is the heart oriented to me? That's going to make all the difference in the world. And that's what we begin to see more and more. All right, so he goes on. He says, in King Rehoboam's 5th year, King Shishak, that's hard to say, of Egypt attacked Jerusalem. This was a king that was not a native Egyptian. He was African, and he had put together this coalition that the people of Egypt recognized was a strong governance, and so they basically handed all of Egypt over to him. They were coming out of one of the weakest periods in their history, and this was like the 22nd dynasty. The Egyptians been around forever, and this guy comes along, and they were weak, and he made them strong. And one of the first things he does to solidify that northeast and eastern border is to make himself known. And so this is what he does. He took the treasures of the Lord's temple and of the royal palace. He took everything, including all the golden shields that Solomon had made. End of story. Now you remember all the chapters we read through? We skipped through most of it. All the accounts of Solomon building all this wealth. There was so much wealth that silver was like rocks on the ground and gold was like the dust on the ground. There was just so much of it, it didn't even have any value really anymore. Jewels on everything. And we talked about how all the jewels really represented, that they provided a radiance so that truly the presence of God was being reflected back onto the people because of all this beauty, and everything was gold plated. And I mean, it's like 7 chapters. And in one verse, It's all gone. So see, God could have cared less about all that. It wasn't part of the deal for God. He's wanting their heart. And so in one verse, everything that all the majesty and all the wealth that Solomon had built is gone. And not just gone to anyone, gone to the one who they came out of slavery. That's where they left their slavery. And now the one who had enslaved them had taken, what would appear to be the riches and treasures of God. So Rehoboam made bronze shields. Compared to gold, bronze is worth not much. To replace them, and he assigned them to the officers of the royal guard who protected the entrance to the royal palace. Whenever the king visited the Lord's temple, the royal guard carried them and they brought them back to the guard room. So you know what that is. Solomon's got his bodyguards and he built them shields to protect, Rehoboam, to protect Rehoboam. Once they were there as an ornate addition to the mightiness of God, these shields. And now these pretend shields, these poor replacements are there, but they're not to reflect the mightiness of God. They're just there to protect Rehoboam, who's not going to be around long anyway. His reign didn't last too long. Then it says, the rest of the events of Rehoboam's reign, including his accomplishments, are all recorded in the scrolls called the Annals of the Kings of Judah. Rehoboam and Jeroboam were continually at war with each other. Rehoboam passed away and was buried with his ancestors in the city of David. His mother was an Ammonite named Naamah. His son Abijah replaced him as king. So this Naamah and the wife and the mothers that we identify later become very significant in the story because they're pagan. And not only are they pagan, but they've been given or afforded a lot of power and influence in the kingdom. And so we finally see the apex of that with Ahab and Jezebel. And we'll get to that story later. But that's where all of this pagan influence really comes to a head. So when we look, let's see. Now let's look at chapter 12 of 2 Chronicles because we get a little more of the story. We read this story and Rehoboam's just terrible. And he does nothing to figure, the Chronicle's more kind to him. It says, after Rehoboam's, this is in verse 1 of chapter 12, after Rehoboam's rule was established and solidified, he and all of Israel rejected the law of the Lord. And the way that the Hebrew writes it here is that they turned their heart from the law. They turned their heart from God. Because they were unfaithful to the Lord, in King Rehoboam's 5th year, King Shishak of Egypt attacked him. He had all this army, 1,200 chariots, 60,000 horsemen, an innumerable number of soldiers who accompanied him from Egypt, including Libyans, Sukkites, and Cushites. He captured the fortified cities of Judah and marched against Jerusalem. So in the Egyptian accountings of this, it's like 17 cities were taken by the Egyptians. Shemaiah the prophet visited Rehoboam and the leaders of Judah who were assembled in Jerusalem because of Shishak. He said to them, "This is what the Lord says. You have rejected me, so I have rejected you and will hand you over to Shishak." So God's very reasonable in this. Right? You reject me, I'm going to reject you. Does that sound a bit childish, you think? No? No, I brought you in this thing for a job. I've got real plans for you. I want to hand over the kings of the kingdom to you one day, right? That's what Jesus says. I'm going to hand over the keys. That's basically what he says in Matthew chapter 16. So But if you're not going to cooperate with me in this, I don't have any real reason to cooperate with you. Because I can't fulfill what I want to do here. So there's that reason. And rarely in previous the Torah and other prophets does God talk a lot about love. He talks about his hesed, where he's going to be faithful and true, and he expects that from us. But where is the one place that we know God speaks about our love for him, or the Israelites' love for him? In Deuteronomy, which we know is the Shema, which says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength." And then it goes on to explain how, that's it. That's it. And then how you're going to do that. The world, everybody's going to know that this is true for you, because you're going to roll up a little scroll and it's going to be put in a box on your wrist. And every time anybody sees that little box on your wrist, they're going to know you're an Israelite and that you love me. Or you put it on your headband around. It's going to be a little box up here. It's going to have written in that scroll, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your heart, soul, and strength." And so this is the one thing that God asked. And if you have that kind of love, then everything I want to do through you will do. But they don't have it. And so he says, look, you've rejected me, meaning you've rejected my love, you've rejected everything about me, and I can't even begin to do any of the things that I wanted to do with you because of my love for you, so I'll just reject you too. Yeah. So he says, the leaders of Israel, the Lord said, the leaders of Israel and the king humbled themselves and said, "The Lord is just." So this message is delivered and they hear it and they say, yeah, this makes perfect sense. There's nothing unreasonable about this. We've rejected him. He rejects us. When the Lord saw that they humbled themselves, the Lord's message came to Shimei. "They have humbled themselves, so I will not destroy them. I will deliver them soon. My anger will not be unleashed against Jerusalem through Shishak. Yet they will become his subjects, so they can experience how serving me differs from serving the surrounding nations." So in the historical writings of Egypt, you find that he never, the Shishak never did enter Jerusalem per se with his army. But in some sort of way they negotiated where they became his feudal servants. Okay? So this is what it's referring to. God allowed for this to happen. And part of the negotiation may very well have been they gave up all the riches, to do that. So King Shishak of Egypt attacked Jerusalem and took away the treasures of the Lord's temple and the royal palace. He took everything, including the gold shields that Solomon had made. He made bronze seals to replace them and assigned them to the officers of the royal guard. Same thing. So when Rehoboam humbled himself to the Lord relented from his anger and did not annihilate him. Judah experienced some good things. Humility brings about good things with God. Imagine that. King Rehoboam solidified his rule in Jerusalem. He was 41 years old when he became king, and he ruled 17 years in Jerusalem, the city the Lord chose from all the tribes of Israel to be his home. Rehoboam's mother was an Ammonite named Naamah. He did evil because he was not determined to follow the Lord. So almost every time you hear her name, or you hear these other mothers or wives' names, it's almost always followed with, "and he did evil," because of the great influence that these pagan women had on these men, these weak, wimpy men. Okay? So we're reminded every time that this was not a part of the plan that God had for his people. And we got off plan and things went wrong. If it would have been okay to marry pagan people and pagan women, and God would have said, yeah, that's the way we're going to do this, is to marry them into the people, then it would have been okay. But God knows the nature of who he's dealing with. And it wasn't okay. So, the events of Rehoboam's reign from start to finish are recorded in the annals of Shemaiah the prophet and of Iddo the seer that include genealogical records. There were wars between Rehoboam and Jeroboam continually. Then Rehoboam passed away and was buried in the city of David. His son Abijah replaced him as king. All right. So now we're into third generation kingship. Now, when we go back to 1 Kings, in chapter 15, there's a small little record about Abijah, and then there's a small little record about Asa, and then Nadab's is small because he don't live long as a king, like 2 years, and he's assassinated. So we get these little snippets in 1 Kings. So to get the meat of what's going on, we have to again go back to 2 Chronicles, where the real lessons are, I think, for us in these different accounts of these kings.
Why did they chop it that way?
Why what?
Why did they make it that way?
Who?
Twin Kings and Chronicles?
Well,
Or some of it was just like
the-
straight history and the other was like...
This is what most commentators believe, is that Kings was written early to the middle of the exile period. So there's about a 35-year period there after the northern kingdom had been moved into exile with Assyria, that they begin to write all this stuff down. And one of the reasons why they wanted to write it down is they didn't want to lose their history. They didn't want to forget what happened, where they got removed from the promised land, where God's had chosen a city where his name would dwell, and that's where he would be. I mean, that was the city that he chose out of all the cities. And then here they were, ripped out of all of that and moved into a place that was not their own. It wasn't a miserable existence. We know from Jeremiah that he tells them, he says, you're here, plant gardens, have families, marry, do all the things that you would normally do, because there's going to be a day when this will be over. I mean, Moses said it, and we're saying it. And so, but they didn't want to forget what got them into trouble in the first place. So the Kings were written in that era, and then most people believe that after that time, after the exiles begin to return mainly to the southern end of the land, that the Chronicles was being written, and it was probably being written by priests who were kind of the record keepers anyway. So that's.
So when they exiled, they just kind of wrote short form.
The exile kind of said, we gotta write all this down. We gotta have a record.
And the Chronicles is when they went back in detail.
And then the Chronicles, when the people started going back and settling the land again, there had to be most people believe that the motivation behind writing was to provide some promise. Just like we read in that particular instance, Rehoboam he's decidedly not a good king. He wasn't a good king when he started. He wasn't a good king when he died. But sandwiched in the middle of that, while he was king, the nation discovered some humility before God, and it said some good things happened. And so there's a ray of hope in that for people that have been away from their home for 75 years and now may have the chance to go back. There's a ray of hope in knowing that we humble ourselves before God and good things begin to happen. Well, isn't that's the same lesson that Christ came teaching? It's the same identical lesson. So, from a Christian perspective, we get the long view of God, and we begin to see this isn't just a shot in the dark or a flash in the pan of the way God deals with people. This is how He is all the time. God really appreciates our humility before Him, and when we're humble before Him, things work out pretty good. And Jesus said the same thing, you know. Only His is 1,000% better than land. You humble yourself, you get the Spirit of God in you, which is pretty good. So, anyway, that's that. Chapter 15, it says Abijah's reign over Judah. So this is Rehoboam's son. In the 18th year of the reign of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, Abijah became king over Judah. He ruled for 3 years in Jerusalem. His mother was Maacah, the daughter of Abishalom. Okay, so this is a pagan woman. He followed all the sinful practices of his father before him. He was not wholeheartedly devoted to the Lord his God, as his ancestor David had been. So that wholeheartedly devoted is his heart was not turned to God at all. And so we still are being reminded that if you want the gold standard for what it means to be a king, you got to look back to David. With all of his problems, God knew David's heart, and it was always turned to him. Nevertheless, for David's sake, the Lord his God maintained his dynasty in Jerusalem by giving him a son to succeed him and by protecting Jerusalem. So when it says son, Abijah's David's son, just genealogically. He did this because David had done what he approved and had not disregarded any of his commandments his entire lifetime, except for the incident involving Uriah the Hittite. All right, so we will always remember the adultery part with Bathsheba. Okay, and that was bad. But we find out that in their culture, not as bad as committing murder. And so we're reminded here, everything about David's life was right in God's eyes, except for this one thing, where he took the lifeblood of another. And God, that's a no-no. Now, was David punished for that by God directly? No. But if you recall, when we went through that whole episode in 2 Samuel, David's heart was in ruins. He couldn't do anything. He couldn't correct his children. He couldn't rule. He couldn't do anything. And Joab became kind of his mouthpiece and his strong arm to get things done, until ultimately David had to do something with Joab, because Joab really was the king. So David really had suffered because of what he had done, just not directly from God. Rehoboam and Jeroboam were continually at war with each other throughout Abijah's lifetime. The rest of the events of Abijah's reign, including all of his accomplishments, are recorded in the scroll called the Annals of the Kings of Judah. Abijah and Jeroboam had been at war with each other. Abijah passed away and was buried in the city of David. His son Asa replaced him as king. All right. What time is it? We got a little time. Let's go back over to 2 Chronicles. Because it's important we get as much of this together, I think, as we can. So we find in the Chronicler that the story of Abijah is much more detailed than what the writer of Kings describes. And you'll, after what we just talked about, the time that it was written, the hope that it's portrayed, we'll see why that is. Remember that he's from the southern kingdom. In the 18th year of the reign of King Jeroboam, Abijah became king of Judah. He ruled for 3 years in Jerusalem. His mother was Micaiah, the daughter of Uriel from Gibeah. Now you're saying to yourself, man, these are not the same names that are in Kings. That's another confusing part of this, is When Kings was written, they used one set of names for people, and when Chronicle uses an entirely different set of name for people. One would be their Hebrew, the way they were identified in their Hebrew name. The other would be identified by their native name. The Chronicle does that more often because they're written in an environment that was not their own. They were writing about people in their native place, so they use their native names. It makes sense. Confused me for the longest time. It says there was a war between Abijah and Jeroboam. Abijah launched the attack with 400,000 well-trained warriors, while Jeroboam deployed against him 800,000 well-trained warriors. Again, the numbers here aren't important. If we go back and look at all the numbers that we went through earlier with the chariots and the soldiers and all of that, they're hyperbolized. They're to make it sound bigger than what it actually was. And this was not uncommon for every culture when they were talking about military conquest.
And then he caught a fish this big.
Yeah, same kind of thing. So for history, it would be believed that 800,000, that 1,200,000 people marched out in battle against each other. When actuality, archaeological discoveries would lead that to be more in the tune of 150, which is still a lot of people. You can't deny the size of that number.
150 or 150,000?
No, 150,000.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm glad you.
Yeah, because that's a drastic.
Yeah. No, it was about 150,000. But this was just a way to make your ancestors look really big.
Yeah.
Okay. And some people have tried to discredit the Bible based on that kind of thing, but you'd only have to discredit all of ancient writing. Just discredit all of it and let's just forget, because that's not the point of the numbers aren't the point. Abijah ascended up Mount Zemarium in the Ephraimite hill country and said, "Listen to me, Jeroboam and all of Israel. Don't you realize that the Lord God of Israel has given David and his dynasty lasting dominion over Israel by a formal covenant?" Now this is important for people that are coming out of exile back into their land. See, they're being reminded of the whole thing in this writing. This is God's deal, and he's given this to David. Don't forget that there's a dynasty in place that's going to rule forever. That's what this is about. Jeroboam, son of Nebat, a servant of Solomon, son of David, rose up and rebelled against his master. Now he's getting a history lesson. Lawless, good-for-nothing men gathered around him and conspired against Rehoboam, son of Solomon, when Rehoboam was an inexperienced young man and could not resist them. Now you are declaring that you will resist the Lord's rule through the Davidic dynasty. You have a huge army and bring with you the gold calves that Jeroboam made for you as gods. But you banished the Lord's priest, Aaron's descendants, and the Levites, and appointed your own priest, just as the surrounding nations do. So, man, he's just slathering it on. Everything that's wrong with the northern kingdom, he's laying it out there. Anyone who comes to consecrate himself with a young bull or 7 rams becomes a priest of these fake gods. But as for us, the Lord is our God, and we have not rejected him. Aaron's descendants serve as the Lord's priests, and the Levites assist them with their work. They offer burnt sacrifices to the Lord every morning and every evening, along with fragrant incense. They arrange the bread of the presence on a ritually clean table and light the lamps on the gold lampstand every evening. So this is like a primer in how to do worship for people that are returning out of exile. And it's being presented for them as the reason why God is going to defeat you today. Okay, so everything's being laid out here. I love it.
So the illegitimate side was basically selling the positions of priesthood.
Oh yeah. You just bring your 2 rams and your whatever your bulls and your rams and sacrifice them.
Then you're ordained.
Yeah, like getting an internet ordination so you can do a wedding somewhere, from the priesthood of Zalawaka, somewhere. and now you're an ordained minister. Yeah, it's kind of like what this was. It's terrible. It's just in God's face. Certainly we are observing the Lord, our God's regulations, but you have rejected him. Now look, God is with us as our leader. Going all the way back to David. Nobody's claimed that since David. I lost my place. His priests are ready to blow the trumpets to signal the attack against you. You Israelites, don't fight against the Lord God if your ancestors, for you will of your ancestors, for you will not win. So he's laid it out there. Now Jeroboam had sent some men to ambush the Judite army from behind. The main army was in front of the Judite army. The ambushers were behind it. The men of Judah turned around and realized that they were being attacked from the front and the rear. So they cried out to the Lord for help. The priests blew their trumpets, and the men of Judah gave the battle cry. As the men of Judah gave the battle cry, God struck down Jeroboam and all Israel before Abijah and Judah. The Israelites fled from before the Judite army, and God handed them over to the men of Judah. Abijah and his army thoroughly defeated them. 500,000 well-trained Israelite men fell dead. That day the Israelites were defeated. The men of Judah prevailed because they relied on the Lord God of their ancestors. Now, you got none of that in 1 Kings, right? All you got is that he was an evil guy. He just did what his mama told him to do, and we worship all these. Okay, so you got both stories. You got both things. You got this guy, and he was not a good king. He was an evil king. He allowed the people to worship idols, and he promoted it. But there was a day. There was a day where they showed up to battle and they were outmanned. And it didn't matter. Their claim was that they were standing there with the God of their fathers. And the reason why they could make that claim is because their worship was true. And that they were going to rely upon him. And when the battle time came, they were completely surrounded and outnumbered. And they cried to God, and God took care of the rest. So for people coming back out of exile, where they had been taken and everything had been taken from them, their city had been destroyed, not a stone was left standing, and they're on their way back, they are reminded that even bad people have a chance with God if they will humble themselves and cry out to him. Because they knew that they had deserved what they got when they went into exile. And the only hope that they had at all when they went back was the God of Israel. See? So all of this is told in this wonderful story where everything laid out. This is what it really means to worship God. This is what it really means to be reliant upon. This is what it really means to be humble before him. And when you return to the land, you need to be like Abijah was this day. Because he wasn't good every day, but God didn't turn his back on him. So you see how when in the New Testament we're taught that when we mess up, we ask for forgiveness. And what does God do? He forgives us. It's simple. We know that we made a mistake, and we ask for his forgiveness, and he forgives us. And then we're told that that's forgotten. It's as far as the east is from the west for him. We mull over it a long time, and it tends to occupy our minds and our hearts too much. But it's forgotten from him because he's got other stuff he's wanting to do with you, see. He's not here to be a therapist where, well, let's work through all that trouble so that you don't ever do it again. God's saying, no, you're going to do it again because you're a broken, sinful mess. And I've already made arrangements for you to be able to ask forgiveness. And not only to receive forgiveness, but to receive it in the form of my son's life and my spirit indwelling in you. Because we've got work to do. We can't worry about all that stuff. We've got things to do. There's a world out there that needs to know that when when they have a life with me, it looks like yours. And I can't do that if you're constantly looking over your shoulder and wondering looking at all the bad stuff and wondering what you left behind. And all they said, I can't do it. It's impossible to do. See? It's all the same, all the way through the story. It's just, it's in different magnitudes as it moves through. And we need to be able to read and discover these things, or else all this, I know I'm sitting here reading it, you're thinking, man, this all sounds the same, and this is just some story that happened a long time ago. But buried in this is this and 100 other things that we won't even get to talk about. I'm just pulling out the main things. And that is, God has got it every time. We just can't reject Him. We have to turn our heart to Him. And it sounds like a simple thing, but there's a lot of things to distract you in the world. I mean, hundreds of things. In these two countries, there was a pole everywhere you could look. They said, man, go worship that. And there's some man or woman over there that'll worship with you, if you know what I mean. Every green hill, just walk up to the hill. There's somebody there. They're worshiping something else up there. Under every tree. I mean, there's distractions everywhere. And in the midst of all of those distractions was the temple where God's name was. He said, that's where my name lives, right there. See? And people weren't even looking that direction anymore. Sounds like today, in a lot of ways. We get distracted by everything that comes along. And we live in an environment that makes everything a crisis. So not only are you distracted by it, your life may depend on it in various ways. Your identity may be renewed or destroyed in however you respond to these things that are going on all around us all the time. And God's, well, in every one of these stories, it keeps talking about turn your heart to my heart. And it's going to be all right. We'll finish 13, so we go on to 14 next week. So Abijah chased Jeroboam. He seized from him these cities, and he names all the cities that he took, border cities, to give protection from the north to the south. The Lord struck him down. Jeroboam did not regain power during the reign of Abijah. The Lord struck him down and he died. So Jeroboam's reign came to an end at this particular episode. Abijah's power grew. He had 14 wives and fathered 22 sons and 16 daughters. The rest of the events of Abijah's reign, including his deeds and sayings, are recorded in the writings of the prophets Iddo. Abijah passed away and was buried in the city of David. His son Asa replaced him as king. During his reign, the land had rest for 10 years. So we're going to stop there because Asa's story is what we're going to spend all next week talking about. There's a lot written about Asa. And he's a good king, and then he doesn't do so good, and he gets back around, and he is good. And, most of us can relate to Asa in a lot of different ways. So we'll spend probably the whole time. There's a short little part in 1 Kings. I don't even think it's
pretty big.
Excuse me?
I said the story of Asa looks a lot bigger in Chronicles.
Yeah, it's only like 13 or 14 verses in Kings, and it really doesn't paint a very good portrait of him, and rightfully so. I mean, it points out the bad things, but there's a lot of things that happened that were very good and came at the right time. He was responsive to God at the right time, and then he did like Saul tended to do. When things would be going good for Saul, he'd just do things on his own. And whenever Saul did that, it cost him his kingship. And when Asa does that, it's basically the same thing. God says, I can't leave you as king because you're doing things on your own. I mean, this is my kingdom. And so we'll get into that. But there's a lot with Asa. Any comments about any of that?